on the Cook Memorial Public Library podcast. I'm Erica O'Rourke, one of the Reader's Advisors at the library, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Becky King. We're thrilled you're joining us to talk about what we've been reading and loving lately. We're gearing up for fall around here, but there's still technically some summer left. So, Becky, what have you been reading to close out the season?
I had been in kind of a reading slump this summer. When I'm in that mode, I kind of go back to my go-to, which is thrillers, which for me are perfect summer fare. So I actually have read two really good ones lately that I'm excited to talk about. So the first one is called Small Town Sins. It's by Ken Jaworowski. But it takes place in a small town in Pennsylvania in the current day. It's one of those towns that has seen better days. Manufacturing jobs are gone, stores are closing, people are moving on. And the story revolves around three normal people that live in the town, and it takes place over the course of just a few days. The people are just their regular townspeople. Nathan is a volunteer fireman, and he and his wife are struggling to get by. And one night, he's the first person on the scene at a house fire and finds a huge amount of cash in the building. No one else is there, and he just decides on the spur of the moment to take the cash. And then our next character is Callie, who's a nurse at the local hospital. She's lonely and more than a little snarky and jaded, and her MO has always been to not get attached to her patients. But that all changes when a 13-year-old girl with terminal cancer is admitted one night, and Callie and the girl form a really tight bond right away. And Callie finds herself at like a moral and legal crossroads when she learns that the girl has a dying wish that her parents just have no intention of fulfilling. Andy is our third main character. He is a gas station attendant and a former drug addict. He has been living a sober life for about 10 years, but goes off the rails again after a tragic event in his life. And he happens to stumble across some really damning information about another person in town and starts out on a manic one-man crusade to bring this person to justice. So these three characters in this town don't really interact with each other. Their stories are kind of running parallel throughout the book, but there's a common thread in all of their stories that involve decisions they make that just blow up their lives.
Okay.
The town itself is kind of a character, kind of the suffocating nature of people who feel like they're stuck there. So it's a short book. It was less than 300 pages and just super fast and great. And it was really suspenseful. It was a debut novel for this author, too, who happens to be a New York Times editor. So kind of knows a little bit about writing, but his first book, and I loved it.
That's fantastic. You have such a knack for finding amazing thrillers. So speaking of places where the town is almost like a character, my first book is set in a town that should be picture perfect. The book that I read was Save What's Left by Elizabeth Castellano, and I have to be honest with you, I'm done with summer. I'm over summer. I want routine, I want structures, I want sweater weather, and it turns out that for me, this is the perfect transition into fall book. It's the story of Kathleen Dean, whose life is upended when her husband decides to go on an around-the-world cruise by himself. So Kathleen, facing the end of her marriage, decides she's going to shake things up too. She's going to buy a beach house on the water on Long Island. She's going to have a breezy, laid-back retirement in this charming little town in her adorable cottage with delightful neighbors. And she gets exactly the opposite of that. Her cottage is a falling-down oyster shack. Her neighbors are building this giant, modern monstrosity of a mansion that everybody calls the Sugar Cube. The rest of the community basically shuns her. The town government is cheerfully, blatantly corrupt. And so Kathleen, who at this point has just had enough, decides to fight back. She starts obsessively attending zoning meetings, emailing the town supervisor, and striking up this really unlikely friendship with the other town outcast. And I did not think this was possible, but then things escalate from there. It is a book for people who like dark, wickedly funny comedy. Kathleen warns the reader very early on that beach towns are teeming with weirdos, no matter what you've read in books. And then she becomes one of those weirdos, and she knows it, and she just can't stop herself. It is snarky and hilarious if you liked Julie Schumacher's Dear Committee Members or any of Abby Waxman's books. I think this is the perfect palate cleanser to get you ready for fall.
Okay, funny that you mention both small towns and corruption, because that's my next one. My next book is called An Honest Man by Michael Corida. It takes place in a small town on a small island off the coast of Maine. And again, another town that's seen better days. Locals have been leaving, nothing much left to support the economy. And it's a suspense thriller with a hugely flawed main character, which I think is the best kind. Anyway, Israel Pike was recently paroled after serving 15 years in prison for killing his father. He decides to return to the town where he grew up, knowing that no one's really very excited to have him back there. His efforts to start fresh kind of come to a grinding halt when he becomes the chief suspect in the murder of 7 men killed aboard a yacht that washes ashore, 2 of whom just happen to be candidates for the U.S. Senate. So there's a little federal interest in that murder case. At the same time, 12-year-old Lyman Rankin, who's another local on the island, runs away from his abusive father and seeks shelter in an abandoned home on the island. And he discovers a frightened and severely injured young woman who also sought refuge there. It's not clear where she came from. It's not clear whether she's connected to the crimes aboard the yacht. But she's certainly scared, and she's threatening to Lyman. She doesn't want him to disclose her whereabouts. So then throw in a powerful and corrupt local sheriff who happens to be Israel's uncle, a federal agent who has been using Israel as an informant in a separate undercover investigation, and then local townspeople who are more than ready to make Israel the scapegoat for all the bad things that are happening in their small town. And you've got a great suspense story. Fast-moving, page-turner. I just loved both Israel and Lyman. They're both characters to root for. And again, somewhat parallel lives on their part. Both were subject to abuse from their fathers, and both are determined not to let that define the rest of their lives. And it plays out in some surprising ways, which is really great.
Ooh, that sounds very intriguing. I think the lesson that I am taking away from this is that small towns all have a dark underbelly.
I think so, at least in these books, the books that I've been reading. I think it makes it more fun, right? Because I think small towns can have that kind of atmosphere where everybody knows everyone, or they think they do, right? And in this case, you don't know as much as you think you do about these people.
I think when you have books that are set in a big city, the tension comes from the anonymity.
Right. And you may not know what you're up against, right?
And the flip side of that in a small town is that the tension comes from the claustrophobia and the secrets. So I will say this is a hard turn from the dark underbellies of small towns. My last selection is much more upbeat. I have a soft spot for Japanese books in translation. And Days at the Murasaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagasawa and translated by Eric Ozawa is my latest find. It is a tiny little slip of a book. It's really more a novella than a full novel. And it's about Takako, a young woman who is absolutely devastated when her weasel of a boyfriend breaks up with her. Like, they're co-workers, and his other girlfriend, because he has another girlfriend, is also her co-worker, and it just makes her life absolutely impossible. So she ends up quitting. Her uncle steps in, and he says, I own this bookshop. Why don't you come move into the apartment above the bookshop since you're not working, and you can work for me? And really, with no other options, that's what she decides to do. She's not a reader at first. She mostly just mopes, like she just sleeps all day, every day when she's not working in the shop. She doesn't want to make friends. She doesn't really want to spend time with her uncle. But the longer that she's in the shop, the more she's drawn to these books. And her discovery of the pleasures of reading and the power of books helps her find her footing, and it helps her connect to all sorts of people in the community. This story is an ode to the power of books, to help us heal, to help us grow, to help us understand ourselves and other people. I think if you like bookish books, ones that are set in a bookshop or a library or in kind of a quirky small town where books play a big role, this is a delightful little diversion. I will, however, give you this fair warning. There are no cats in this book. There is an adorable cat on the cover. And so you think you're going to go in and find a cute story about a bookshop cat. There is no cat. But despite that, it is a delight, and I strongly recommend it.
It sounds great, but that was unfair about the cat, I have to say.
Yes. It has a very cat-like feel to it. It's cozy and warm, but it does not actually have a cat. I'm really sorry. It's still worth your time.
Okay, I agree. And so it sounds delightful and so different from, the other books that we talked about today, which
Yes.
makes it all the more appealing, I think.
It's a perfect launch you into fall reading season book. I'm a very seasonal reader.
Are you?
I am.
I like thrillers in general, but I do tend to read them in the summer. Yeah, they go down easy for me.
And fall for me is definitely a time for big, more literary books.
Yeah, for
and,
sure.
Door stoppers. Which is perfect because our fall book buzz is coming up. If you're interested in some of the big buzzy books coming out this season, make sure to register for that so you can get a sneak peek of the titles that we are most excited to read. Thanks again for joining us today. We'll be sure to put links to all of these titles and the fall book buzz in our show notes. You can always find us on the library's website, Shelf Life the blog, or by emailing us. And as always, you can support the podcast by sharing this episode with your friends and subscribing wherever you get your podcast. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, keep reading, keep watching, and keep listening.